The Appalachian Patriarch of Sin, too degenerate for the history books to ever record. Deep within the mist-shrouded hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, far from civilization's prying eyes, there existed communities whose bloodlines twisted in upon themselves, much like the winding mountain roads that kept them isolated from the outside world. This is the story of the Blackwood family, a dynasty built on forbidden unions whose legacy of consanguinity spanned 4 generations between 1887 and 1956, a legacy that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own genetic deterioration. Our tale begins during the harsh winter of 1887 in McDowell County, West Virginia. While coal mining had brought prosperity to some parts of the region, families like the Blackwoods, deep in the remote hollows, maintained a separate existence, isolated by both choice and geography. The undisputed patriarch of a growing clan was Ezekiel Blackwood, born in 1859. A man of imposing stature, he had piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through a person rather than at them. With an iron will, Ezekiel ruled his family. Local records indicate that by 1887, Ezekiel had fathered 12 children with 3 different women. What wasn't recorded in official documents, but was whispered among neighboring communities, was that 2 of these women were his first cousins. The third, Martha, was allegedly his half-sister. This claim, however, was never officially substantiated, due to the family's notorious secrecy and poor record-keeping. Sprawling across 200 acres of mountainous terrain was the Blackwood property. At the center of what locals had begun calling Blackwood Hollow stood their main dwelling, a ramshackle 2-story structure built of rough-hewn timber. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Various branches of the expanding family were housed in several smaller cabins that dotted the property. By 1899, it was estimated that over 40 individuals with Blackwood blood lived on the property, many of them the products of unions between close relatives. Concerning physical characteristics that could only be attributed to their parents' close blood relation were noted in the personal journal of Dr. Thomas Harrington, a physician who occasionally ventured into the remote areas of McDowell County, dated October 1, 1892. The Blackwood children, he wrote, display malformed limbs, diminished mental capacity, and distinctive facial features, including unusually close-set eyes and pronounced prognathism. I fear what may become of future generations should this practice continue. Indeed, the consequences of generations of consanguineous marriages were becoming increasingly evident. By the turn of the century, visible signs of genetic decline were showing in the 3rd generation of Blackwoods. Local school teachers' historical accounts describe children with stunted growth, unusual facial features, and severe learning difficulties. Many never attended school at all, kept hidden away on the family property. The isolation of the Blackwood clan was not merely geographical, but deliberately cultivated by Ezekiel himself. Bordering on paranoia was his pathological distrust of outsiders. He was known to greet strangers with a shotgun and had instilled in his children and grandchildren a deep fear of the outside world. His purposes were served by this enforced isolation, as it prevented outside scrutiny of his unorthodox family structure and the increasingly apparent consequences of inbreeding. From Rebecca Turner, a midwife called to the property in 1905 to assist with a difficult birth, comes the most detailed account of life within Blackwood Hollow. In her private correspondence to her sister, she wrote, "What I witnessed on the Blackwood property will haunt me until my dying day." The young woman in labor was clearly related to the father of her child. They shared the same distinctive features that marked them as siblings or at least half-siblings. The infant, when finally delivered after a torturous labor, exhibited physical abnormalities so severe that I doubted it would survive the week. The family seemed unsurprised by this outcome, suggesting it was not an uncommon occurrence. By 1910, rumors of the Blackwood family had spread throughout the county. Local authorities, however, were reluctant to intervene. The hollow was difficult to access and previous attempts to investigate the family had been met with violent resistance. Additionally, the prevailing attitude of the time allowed for considerable privacy in family matters, even when welfare concerns existed. Ezekiel's control over his expanding clan reached its zenith in 1915 when he was approximately 56 years old. By then, his children from his first unions had produced numerous offspring of their own, many through relationships with their cousins or half-siblings. The pairings within his family were reportedly hand-selected by Ezekiel, ostensibly to keep the bloodline pure. According to one family member who later escaped the hollow, confer a increto nescanal paranopinum dital chicante sabra as familias meis degeneratus qa histori sociotentum silencar mosquenus stramos illu. The unexpected death of Ezekiel in 1923 at 64 years of age marked the turning point in the Blackwood saga. The patriarch had maintained his iron grip on the family despite his advancing years. His death, reportedly from pneumonia, though some accounts suggest more sinister circumstances, created a power vacuum within the clan. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. His eldest surviving son, Jeremiah, attempted to assume control, but he lacked his father's commanding presence and ruthless determination. The 1920s brought changes even to the remote hollows of Appalachia. Total isolation became more difficult to maintain due to improved roads, the spread of automobile ownership, and an increasing government presence. Following Ezekiel's death, cracks began to appear in the family's wall of secrecy. Several younger members, less indoctrinated than their elders, began venturing into nearby towns, exposing themselves to outside influences and revealing glimpses of their unusual family structure to the wider community. One of these was Sarah Blackwood, born in 1905. Believed to be the daughter of Ezekiel and his youngest wife, who was likely his own daughter from his first union, Sarah possessed a keen intelligence that had somehow survived the genetic lottery of her heritage, despite severe physical disabilities including a malformed spine and partial blindness. At the age of 20, in 1925, she managed to escape Blackwood Hollow with the assistance of a sympathetic store clerk in the nearest town. The most comprehensive first-hand description of life within the Blackwood family comes from Sarah's account, documented by a social worker in Charleston named Eleanor Walsh. From my earliest memories, Sarah reportedly told Walsh, I understood that our family was different. Marriages happened within our property, conducted by my grandfather himself. No outsiders were ever brought in. Children who looked too different or couldn't work were kept hidden away in a separate cabin we called the Quiet House. Some disappeared entirely, though no one ever spoke of where they went. The Quiet House Sarah described would later become a focus of investigation. According to her testimony, children born with severe deformities or intellectual disabilities, increasingly common as the generations progressed, were segregated from the main family and kept in deplorable conditions. These children, the most visible evidence of the family's consanguineous practices, were rarely seen by even other family members. The first serious investigation into the Blackwood family was sparked by Sarah's escape and subsequent testimony. In November 1925, county officials accompanied by state police attempted to access the property, but were driven back by armed resistance. This standoff continued intermittently for nearly a year, with authorities reluctant to use force due to concerns about the many women and children on the property. Meanwhile, the genetic consequences of nearly 4 decades of inbreeding had become catastrophic. When authorities finally gained access to some of the younger Blackwood children in 1926, medical records document conditions including polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, severe intellectual disability, congenital heart defects, and a distinctive facial appearance that one physician described as immediately identifiable as resulting from consanguineous parentage. A 1927 census of the property, the first official accounting of the Blackwood clan, identified 67 individuals across 4 generations. Of these, at least 30 displayed significant physical or intellectual abnormalities. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that infant mortality within the family had reached nearly 60%. Many children did not survive their first year, and those who did survive often faced lifelong health challenges. A disturbing lack of concern about the family's obvious genetic decline was displayed by the eldest living members of the clan, those directly descended from Ezekiel's first generation. They had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into Ezekiel's belief system that they viewed the family's isolation and inner marriage as virtuous rather than harmful. In their worldview, shaped entirely by the patriarch's teachings, the outside world was corrupt, and only by maintaining the purity of their bloodline could they remain spiritually clean. This belief system, a twisted perversion of religious and regional cultural values, had been crafted by Ezekiel to justify his control over the family and his own desires. He had created a self-serving mythology, passed down through oral tradition, that positioned the Blackwoods as special chosen people whose bloodline connected them directly to divine power. Outsiders were portrayed as spiritually polluted and dangerous. By 1928, authorities had managed to remove 17 of the youngest children from the property, placing them in institutions or foster care. Contemporary accounts from social workers described these children as severely traumatized, many unable to speak or interact normally with others. Their adjustment to life outside Blackwood Hollow was difficult and for some ultimately impossible. They had been raised in an environment so removed from normal society that the outside world remained permanently foreign and frightening. Without his authoritarian control, the Blackwood property itself, once Ezekiel's isolated kingdom, began to disintegrate. Jeremiah, who had attempted to take his father's place, lacked both his charisma and his cruelty. Under his weaker leadership, different factions formed within the family. Some, particularly from the younger generation, advocated for more contact with the outside world. Others, mostly older members who had been closest to Ezekiel, insisted on maintaining complete isolation. New challenges were brought to the already struggling Blackwood clan by the Great Depression beginning in 1929. The economic hardship that swept the nation hit Appalachia particularly hard. The family, which had subsisted primarily through small-scale farming, hunting, and occasional coal mining, found their meager resources stretched to breaking point. This economic pressure forced more interaction with the outside world as younger family members sought employment in nearby towns. One of these was Elijah Blackwood, born in 1912. Believed to be Ezekiel's grandson, or possibly great-grandson, the exact relationships had become increasingly difficult to determine as the family tree twisted in on itself. In 1930, Elijah found work at a sawmill and became the first Blackwood in generations to marry an outsider, a young woman named Ruby Allen. A severe rift within the clan was created by this breach of the family's most sacred taboo. Elijah was entirely disowned by Jeremiah and his supporters, but a smaller faction, seeing the obvious health improvements in Elijah and Ruby's children compared to their cousins, began to question the family's long-held beliefs about intermarriage. The 1930s brought increased medical and scientific understanding of genetics. In 1933, a physician named Dr. Howard Mitchell from Johns Hopkins University heard about the Blackwood family through academic circles and sought permission to study them. His initial requests were denied by both the family and local authorities, who by then were trying to minimize public attention to the case. However, Mitchell persisted, arguing that scientific understanding gained from studying the family could help prevent similar situations in the future. In 1934, Mitchell was finally granted limited access to medical records and was able to interview several former members of the F clan who had left the Hollow. His resulting paper, Genetic Consequences of Sustained Consanguinity, the Blackwood Case Study *, published in 1936, became an important early document in the field of genetic counseling. Though it was careful to anonymize the family to protect their privacy, Mitchell's study documented a progressive deterioration in genetic health across 4 generations. The first generation, Ezekiel's immediate children from his unions with first cousins, showed relatively mild effects, slightly reduced intelligence, minor physical anomalies, and increased susceptibility to certain illnesses. By the 4th generation, however, the consequences had become severe with high rates of stillbirth, dramatic physical deformities, and profound intellectual disabilities. Mitchell's work provided some of the earliest scientific documentation of the exponential increase in genetic abnormalities through sustained inbreeding. I ask you this: could you have survived in such isolation, in a community built on forbidden bloodlines? If this story touches your heart, Tight Blood remembers what history tries to forget in the comments. This small act helps our stories reach others who seek the hidden truths that shaped our world. By 1937, the original Blackwood property was home to fewer than 30 individuals, down from its peak of nearly 70. Many had died. Others had been removed by authorities or had chosen to leave. Those who remained were primarily the older generation and those too disabled to live independently. Conditions on the property continued to deteriorate, with poverty compounding the health challenges faced by the family. In 1938, a significant fire destroyed the main Blackwood dwelling in 2 of the smaller cabins. The cause was never determined, though speculation ranged from accidental to intentional. 3 family members perished in the blaze. In the aftermath, local authorities finally had the leverage they needed to intervene more directly. The surviving family members were evacuated and the property was condemned. The dispersal of the remaining Blackwoods marked the effective end of the isolated community Ezekiel had created. Older members were placed in county care facilities, while younger ones with relatives outside the hollow were sometimes able to integrate into those households. The notorious Quiet House, when finally examined by authorities, was found to be empty, though evidence suggested it had indeed been used to house severely disabled family members in deplorable conditions. What had happened to these individuals remains one of the darkest mysteries of the Blackwood saga. The story might have ended there, fading into local legend, but for the efforts of anthropologist Margaret Collins, who in 1942 began documenting the diaspora of the Blackwood family as part of a broader study on isolated Appalachian communities. Collins traced over 50 individuals with Blackwood blood living throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia. Her work revealed that those who had managed to break away from the hollow and established families with non-relatives showed remarkable resilience. In one particularly poignant case, Anna Blackwood, who had left the hollow in 1927 at age 16, had married a man from outside the family and had 3 healthy children. In her interview with Collins, Anna expressed both grief and anger about her upbringing. "What was done to us was wrong. I knew it even as a child, though I had no words for it then. My children will never know that life. They will never marry their cousins. They will be free to choose their own paths." The scientific understanding of why consanguinity leads to genetic decline was still developing during this period, but the observable effects were undeniable. Dr. Mitchell, in a follow-up study conducted in 1944, documented how the Blackwood descendants who had outbred for even a single generation showed dramatic improvements in health outcomes. This provided compelling evidence of the body's remarkable ability to recover from genetic stress when consanguinity is discontinued. The post-World War II era brought significant changes to Appalachia, including improved roads, rural electrification, and greater government presence. These developments further integrated former members of the Blackwood clan into wider society, though stigma followed them wherever they went. The family name itself had become associated with deformity and degradation throughout the region, leading many to change their surnames and conceal their heritage. In 1950, the former Blackwood property, which had stood abandoned for over a decade, was purchased by a timber company. During clearing operations, workers made a grisly discovery: a small cemetery containing at least 26 graves, most unmarked. Given the family's history, authorities suspected these might be the remains of infants and children who had died from complications related to inbreeding. However, with the family dispersed and many of the elder members deceased, there was no one who could provide definitive information. A local prosecutor briefly considered opening a formal investigation, but ultimately decided against it. Too much time had passed, and proving any specific wrongdoing would be nearly impossible. The graves were documented, and the remains were left in place, though the cemetery was properly enclosed and marked. This quiet acknowledgement was the closest thing to justice that the victims of Ezekiel Blackwood's dynastic ambitions would receive. The scientific legacy of the Blackwood case continued to develop. In 1952, geneticist Dr. Eleanor Simmons revisited the data collected by Dr. Mitchell, applying new understandings of genetic inheritance that had emerged in the intervening years. Her analysis provided valuable insights into specific recessive disorders that had manifested in the family, including several rare conditions that appeared with unusual frequency among the Blackwoods. Dr. Simmons managed to interview 12 individuals from the 3rd and 4th generations of the family, all of whom had left Blackwood Hollow before its final dissolution. Her research painted a complex picture of life within the clan. While Ezekiel's iron rule and the practice of consanguinity were clearly abusive, many former members expressed ambivalence about their upbringing. They described a strong sense of a belonging and family loyalty that, despite everything, they sometimes missed in the outside world. One particularly revealing interview was with Joseph Blackwood, born in 1918, who had left the Hollow in 1936. Despite suffering from a mild intellectual disability and physical abnormalities consistent with consanguineous parentage, Joseph had managed to build a life for himself, working as a janitor and marrying a woman not related to the family. "We didn't know any different," he told Dr. Simmons. "That was just our way. Only when I left I understand that the world saw us as wrong." By the mid-1950s, the Blackwood name had begun to fade from public consciousness. The property that had once housed the clan was now unrecognizable, transformed by logging operations and natural reclamation. The family members who had survived and integrated into broader society rarely spoke of their backgrounds, and many of their descendants grew up unaware of their heritage. However, the medical and genetic legacy persisted. Healthcare providers in the region became adept at recognizing the distinctive constellation of traits that marked individuals with Blackwood ancestry. Even into the third generation of outbreeding, certain recessive conditions continue to appear with unusual frequency when carriers happen to have children together, a testament to the deep genetic impact of the family's history. In 1955, a graduate student named Thomas Bennett conducted interviews with elderly residents of McDowell County who remembered the Blackwood family. These oral histories, while sometimes embellished or contradictory, provided additional context about how the surrounding community had viewed the clan. Most expressed a mixture of fear, pity, and disgust, though some acknowledged that more could have been done to intervene earlier. One consistent theme in these accounts was the almost mythological status that Ezekiel had attained in local law. He was described variously as a tyrant, a madman, and even by some as possessed by evil spirits. His death in 1923 had been surrounded by rumors. Some claimed he was murdered by his own children. Others that he died cursing the world that had tried and failed to intrude upon his domain. These stories, while unverifiable, speak to the powerful impression the patriarch had made on the collective imagination of the region. The last significant documentation of the Blackwood saga came in 1956 when a regional health survey identified 43 living individuals with confirmed Blackwood ancestry. This survey noted that while many still carry genetic markers from their inbred heritage, the integration of new genetic material through outbreeding had dramatically improved health outcomes. The family's younger generation, now 2 or 3 generations removed from the practices of Blackwood Hollow, showed few visible signs of their ancestry. This survey effectively marked the end of the Blackwood family as a distinct entity. Their story, once a shocking example of the consequences of isolation and consanguinity, gradually transformed into a cautionary tale, then a whispered legend, and finally a footnote in academic studies of Appalachian history and genetic inheritance. Beyond their genetic heritage, the legacy of the Blackwood family extends into broader questions about isolation, authority, and the complex interplay between culture and biology. The conditions that allowed Ezekiel to establish his secluded dynasty were not unique to him or his family, but were products of geography, history, and social forces that shaped Appalachia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The extreme isolation of many mountain communities during this period created fertile ground for the development of unorthodox family structures. Poor transportation infrastructure, limited educational opportunities, and economic marginalization all contributed to an environment where families like the Blackwoods could exist for generations with minimal outside interference. The rugged individualism celebrated in Appalachian culture, while often a source of strength and resilience, could also enable abuses when taken to extremes. Ezekiel Blackwood, by all accounts, was a man of considerable intelligence and charisma. Despite his limited formal education, he understood instinctively how to use isolation as a tool of control and how to craft a belief system that served his purposes. His success in creating and maintaining a multi-generational dynasty built on consanguinity speaks to his psychological insight, however perversely applied. The role of local authorities in allowing the situation to persist for so long also merits consideration. Contemporary accounts suggest that officials were aware of rumors about the Blackwood family for years before any action was taken. Their reluctance to intervene stemmed from a combination of factors. The difficulty of accessing the remote property, concern about armed resistance, the era's more limited understanding of child welfare, and a general hesitancy to interfere in family matters. By the time significant intervention finally occurred in the late 1920s, for generations had lived under conditions of enforced consanguinity, the genetic damage was extensive and for many irreversible. Dozens of children might have been spared from being born into lives marked by preventable suffering had earlier action been taken. The scientific understanding gained from studying the Blackwood case has contributed significantly to our knowledge of genetic inheritance and the biological consequences of inbreeding. The family's history provides one of the most thoroughly documented examples of sustained consanguinity in modern American history, with genetic effects traced across multiple generations, both during the period of inbreeding and, importantly, through the subsequent recovery as family members integrated into the wider gene pool. Dr. Simmons' work in the 1950s was particularly valuable in demonstrating how quickly genetic health can improve when consanguinity is discontinued. The children and grandchildren of those who left Blackwood Hollow showed remarkable biological resilience, with each generation moving further from the physical and cognitive challenges that had marked their ancestors. This aspect of the story offers a measure of hope amid the tragedy, a testament to the human body's capacity for renewal when freed from the constraints of a limited genetic pool. It also underscores the fundamental importance of genetic diversity for human health and well-being, a principle now firmly established in medical science, but dramatically illustrated by the Blackwood experience. The psychological and social impacts on those who survived Blackwood Hollow are harder to quantify, but no less significant. Former members interviewed by researchers consistently described difficulties adjusting to outside society, including challenges forming normal social relationships, persistent trauma responses, and complex feelings about their family heritage. Many expressed a sense of being caught between worlds, no longer part of the insular community they had known, but never fully integrated into mainstream society. For the surrounding communities, the Blackwood saga left lasting effects as well. The hollow itself became a place avoided by locals, surrounded by superstition and dark rumors. The family name evolved into a regional slur used to imply genetic inferiority or moral degeneracy. This stigma affected even Blackwood descendants who had no connection to the practices of the hollow, demonstrating how the consequences of such situations can extend far beyond those directly involved. By the 1960s, improved access to education, health care, and social services throughout Appalachia had made it much more difficult for situations like the Blackwood case to develop or persist. The extreme isolation that had enabled Ezekiel's dynasty was becoming increasingly rare, and greater awareness of child welfare issues meant that authorities were more likely to intervene when concerns arose. Today, the Blackwood story survives primarily in academic context, cited in studies of genetics, Appalachian history, and the sociology of isolated communities. The exact location of Blackwood Hollow has been lost to time, the property boundaries redrawn through multiple sales and developments over the decades. The unmarked cemetery discovered in 1950 remains the only physical testament to the family's existence, a quiet memorial to lives shaped by one man's distorted vision. The final word on the Blackwood saga perhaps belongs to Anna Blackwood, who survived the hollow to build a new life. In her last interview with anthropologist Margaret Collins in 1963, then an elderly woman with grandchildren of her own, she reflected, "What happened to us shouldn't happen to anyone, but I want people to understand that we weren't monsters or freaks. We were people trapped in a terrible situation, not of our making. Remember us not as curiosities, but as a warning about what can happen when power goes unchecked and human beings are treated as means to an end rather than as people deserving of dignity and freedom. If you watched until here, it's because you appreciated this dark chapter of American history. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched until the end so I can get to know you and understand who truly values the forgotten stories on this channel.' Don't forget to subscribe to continue receiving these hidden historical accounts that mainstream media won't cover. Like this video to help others discover these important truths, and share with anyone who appreciates learning about the darker chapters of our shared past.